Okay, let's take a look at the Book of Esther. Esther is a historical event that happened around the time period of 483 BC to 473 BC. In this historical event, you'll see where there were two assassination plots, one for one person and then one for a huge group of people. You also see what some call a beauty pageant, but considering the world we live in today, I'm not so sure it wouldn't be called human trafficking. And we see how a single person has truly the weight of the world on her shoulders, and she needs to make a decision, and how she made that decision through prayer and fasting and wise counsel to ultimately save a nation. So the Book of Esther is a fascinating book in the Bible that many people overlook. However, it is truly an amazing book. One other note of this book is that it does not mention God. It's the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God, yet it's included in the Bible. And the reason for that, I believe, is because God is instrumental through every single aspect of this book. It's clear to see that the people within this historical event were placed in certain roles for certain reasons, which brings it back to us today in thinking, have you been put into a specific role? Have we had experience or education, or maybe we're not prepared at all, but God is putting us into a specific place and time for us to do something. A couple of the famous lines from this book are, "For just a time as this," and I believe that's so true, that Esther was placed in this position for such a time, as well as her other famous line of, "If I perish, I perish." And that means that she was willing to risk it all. She knew, with wise counsel from her cousin, she knew that she was in a place that she needed to do something. It was not wise for her to sit quiet and do nothing. So let's get started with the Book of Esther. I'm going to introduce to you the main characters. So King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes I, was born in 519 BC. His father was Darius the Great, and his mother was Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great. So this person was born into royal lineage. They were kings. They had palaces. They ruled large expanses of land. They went to battle. They had tons of people under them in their royal hierarchy that had to answer to them, that had to do whatever they said they wanted them to do. So King Ahasuerus was used to getting his way. He was used to having power and authority over people, and he had everything that he could ever want right at his fingertips. Now, the word Xerxes means ruling over heroes, and like many other books in the Bible, people have different names. So we even see this with Esther. She had a different name as well. But Ahasuerus and Xerxes I are the same people. Now, he was the Persian king between 486 and 465 BC. He stepped into that role when his father was killed. Darius the Great was killed, and then he ended that role when he himself was assassinated. The empire that he had has several names, actually. The Achaemenid Empire, it's the Persian Empire. He was essentially king of the Persians and the Medes, which, if you're familiar with biblical context, those names come up quite frequently. And he was known as Xerxes the Great, which, interestingly, he was a rival even before, hundreds of years before Alexander the Great came along. He became Alexander the Great's rival, although he was already dead. So I'll explain a little bit more of that in a minute. But Xerxes the Great came before Alexander the Great, and then years later, Alexander the Great showed up. And so he is part of this story as well. Like I mentioned, Xerxes I was assassinated in 465 BC by Artabanus of Persia. So in looking at this, I was curious, how big is this Persian Empire? The Bible tells us it's 127 provinces that span between Egypt and India. We don't see the Persian Empire in many maps today, so I had to look into it and see what was happening and what all was included, and really, is it such a large empire in comparison to the world today? Well, the Guinness's World Book of Records estimates that the Achaemenid Empire, or the Persian Empire, held about 44% of the world's population. So if we can imagine today, that would be a huge empire. It would have been a huge empire back then, much less a huge empire today. So it was known as the largest and most powerful empire in the world. Now, if we looked at that per person, clearly there were fewer people on the earth back then than there are today. But to just know that this one empire being ruled by Xerxes the First had 44% of the world's population. And I think that just adds to his power and control and authority. And you'll see with his choice in what to do with his wife, all of this makes sense when you have a person that has that much control, that much power. He's bound to have a big ego, and he thinks he can do anything that he wants. So how did they get all of this land? Well, I'm going to show you the timeline just within Xerxes I, but to know that he came from this long lineage, this had been generations of battles that finally conquered this much land. So Darius I, Xerxes' father, declared himself an Aryan. Aryan, we see, is also very similar to the word Iran. And I'll show you this here in a minute, but essentially Iran, what we know today as Iran in the Middle East, is where the Persian Empire was at. And the word Iran is similar to the word Aryan, which is that one sole race. Herodotus wrote that Medians were known as Aryans. And so, like I said, we'll talk more about the Medes and Persians in the future. But Aryans, it's important to know that this large Persian Empire was predominantly of the Aryan race. In 1935, the Persians changed the name to Iran. And again, this is how that name came to be. Aryan and Iran, they sound similar. And at one point in time, that entire nation was all one race. So here's the battle line just with the time period of Xerxes, starting in 486 BC. So he conquered Babylon the next year. He also went to Thermopylae in 480 BC, and at that point in time, he had the largest ever assembled military. He had over 200,000 soldiers and 1,000 ships. With that military campaign, he torched Athens, and this is where Alexander the Great comes into play. Now, Alexander the Great had not been born yet when Xerxes the Great did this. However, the town of Athens knew that something was coming about, so they fled. All of the people that lived there left and hid. They got away from the danger. When Xerxes and his military showed up, no one was there. So he literally torched the town. He destroyed everything that was there. Hundreds of years later, when Alexander the Great was coming back to conquer Persia, he went specifically to Xerxes' palace and destroyed it. And there's talk about the detail that went in to make sure that any statue that had Xerxes the Great face on it, Alexander the Great or someone in his military took painstakingly detail to destroy that face. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. So another battle that he had was the Battle of Artemisium in 480 BC. And then after that, things didn't go as well for Xerxes. He tried to conquer Greece, but each of the campaigns failed. However, the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC is considered one of the most important battles in history because it saved Greece. And this was another Navy campaign and those Navy ships, at least the Athenian ships, are called triremes. He had a total of 3 that I could find, 3 campaigns in Greece, and they all failed. Now, what I thought was interesting about this timeline is, one, I've heard of Alexander the Great, and other than the Book of Esther, I had not really heard of Xerxes. Didn't know he was Xerxes the Great. I didn't know that he had torched Athens, and I didn't know that he had this failed attempt that's considered the most important battle in history in Greece. So I think that's interesting for us to think about the history that we've been taught over the years, what has been included and what has not been included. Just something to think about there. All right, so after Darius passed, that was Xerxes' father, passed, Xerxes had a to-do list. His dad had lots of unfinished construction projects. So along with all the battles that he had to do, he also had these construction projects that he had to finish. One of them was the Gate of All Nations, and that's what this picture is here. Through that gate, anybody of royalty, kings or such, would walk through that gate. It was something to show off with. Really, this palace, this Persian Empire, everything that Xerxes touched seemed to be something to be showing off with. He also completed the Stair of All Nations, the Hall of 100 Columns at Persepolis, the Apadana Palace, which is the palace of his father. So even while his father was living, that palace wasn't completely finished. Now, that doesn't mean that he was living in a dilapidated house by any means. It just means that the palace, the expanse of the palace and how big and glamorous that it was, wasn't finished. The Tekkera, which is the exclusive palace of Darius the Great, was also finished. So Darius had multiple palaces, and you'll see in some of the pictures, if you look at the pictures or if you go to Iran and you visit these places, there's been a lot of archaeology taking place, digging up these old sites and trying to preserve what's left. So he had multiple places to live. There was the treasury of Persepolis, and then the grand palace of Xerxes was completed. So he was busy. Xerxes was a busy guy. And this may make more sense then as to why he treated his wife the way he treated his wife. All right, so this is modern day Iran, and this is what's left of Xerxes' palace. When it was at its heyday, it was twice the size of his father's. He always wanted to be bigger and better and have the shinier things than his father. So it was always bigger. It's called Hades, or the dwelling place. It had 36 columns surrounded by 6 smaller rooms. Just the main room did. So that's huge. And like I said, Alexander the Great destroyed that in 330 BC. Now in the Bible, in the book of Esther, Esther 1, 4 through 9, we read that Xerxes I was having this feast, a 180-day, just huge festival, banquet, feast, whatever you want to call it. Now this is a picture that somebody clearly drew. We couldn't have taken pictures back then, but somebody drew this, and that's what they think maybe the palace looked like in Persepolis. So you can see where there's all these different rooms. There's lots of gold and splendor. It's where he's showing off to his town that he is, the king of all kings at this point. He thinks that he is the ruler of all things. So in Esther 1, it says, he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his majestic greatness for a lengthy period of time, 180 days to be exact. Now, if you can imagine, this would all be full of people from all over Persia and probably beyond, people that he wanted to show off to, people that he wanted to impress. Now, when he was 7 days into the banquet, the book of Esther says, when those days were completed, the king then provided a 7-day banquet for all the people who were present in Susa, the citadel, for those of highest standing to the most lowly. So he included everybody. It was held in the court located in the garden of the royal palace. We think it may have looked something like this. The furnishings included white linen and blue curtains hung by cords of the finest linen and purple wool on silver rings. Alabaster columns, gold and silver couches displayed on a floor made of valuable stones of alabaster, mother of pearl and mineral stone, Drinks were served in golden containers, all of which differed from one another. Royal wine was available in abundance at the king's expense. There were no restrictions on the drinking, for the king had instructed all his supervisors that they should do as everyone so desired. And his queen, Queen Vashti, also gave a banquet for the women in King Ahasuerus' royal palace. So most of this that we see here was probably all men. And then there was another section of the palace where the queen would have all of the ladies. Now, Queen Vashti, to get a little bit of context of who she wasn't just some lady. She was the great-granddaughter of King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon. She was the granddaughter of King Marduk and the daughter of King Belshazzar. So she herself was royalty. So how did she end up with Xerxes? Well, her father was killed by mobs of Medes and Persians. If we think back, the Medes and Persians are part of this Persian Empire that looked to King Xerxes for instruction. So they would have also looked to Darius for instruction. So basically, her husband or her husband's family was probably responsible for the death of her father. Vashti was kidnapped by King Darius of Persia and then given to his son, Xerxes. So she was basically kidnapped and being held in the palace as the queen. Now, who knows if she was there at this point in time, if she had just accepted her role and did as she was asked, or if she even enjoyed being the queen, or if she was there really under the pretenses that she didn't want to be there. She was holding a grudge that this person or her Xerxes' father had killed her father. So all of that sort of plays into your mind of what was she thinking being there? Did she want to be there? Was she trying to run away, or did she know that she had no other option? Some say that when the king asked for her to come, so at the end of that 7-day period when Xerxes had been drinking so much, he asked his servants to go and get Vashti and bring her to him, and she didn't go. Some think that it was because she was a slave. Some think that it was because it was a holy day, the Sabbath, and she wasn't going to go anywhere on that day because she would look at it as work. Some think that maybe she had leprosy. I couldn't find anything else about that, but I did see one mention that maybe she had leprosy, and because her body was disfigured, she didn't want to show up in front of everybody. Now, I'm not sure that's the case because according to scripture, she was having a similar banquet for the women. So I'm not sure that's the case, but I mention it because that's what the research showed. And some look at her to be a feminist icon because she refused to obey her husband. And whatever the reason was, the point is she didn't do as she was commanded. And the way the rules worked back then, if the queen defied her husband, if she didn't come when he asked, if she did show up and he didn't want her to, she could be killed. So this was a big risk for her to take, to just defy her husband, especially when he had so many people in his beautiful palace that he was trying to show off to. And all of a sudden, his dear wife says no to him. So that was a big deal. So Esther 1, verses 10 through 12 says, on the 7th day, as King Ahasuerus was feeling the effects of the wine, he ordered some of his servants, they were 7 eunuchs who attended him, to bring Queen Vashti into the king's presence wearing her royal high turban. He wanted to show the people and the officials her beauty, for she was very attractive. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's bidding, conveyed through the eunuchs. The king became extremely angry, and his rage consumed him. Now, what happened at that point, and we now have the introduction of Queen Esther, is that Queen Vashti was basically told, you need to go away. You can no longer confront the king. You're no longer welcome here. And the Bible doesn't give a lot of detail to that, but it basically says that the king decided, and he had his group of men around him, and they all decided that, well, if Queen Vashti is defying her husband, that's setting setting a model, like a role model for other women, that they don't have to do what their husbands tell them to do. So we should banish her. She needs to go away so that other women in the Persian Empire know that they need to obey their husbands. And that's essentially what happened. Then after a period of time, King Xerxes got lonely and he wanted another wife. So what he did was he called for all the women in the Persian Empire to come and stay at his palace for 12 months. I'll get to that a little bit more here in a minute, but the one that he picked eventually was Queen Esther. Now her name was Hadassah, and then it was changed to Esther. So a little bit about Esther. Esther was a Jew, and she was there in Susa, the citadel, because she was in exile. The reason she was there is that, if you recall, with Moses, when he was taking out the Israelites from Egypt and trying to save them, then his son Solomon built a temple. And Solomon was the wisest of all men, and he built this temple, and the temple gave them access to God. People would go to the temple and make offerings, they would pray. So the temple was very special. Solomon built that around 957 BC, and it was destroyed by the Babylonian army in 586 BC. So at that point in time, when it was destroyed, all the Jews fled. And at this point, a lot of Jews are here in Susa. Now, the second temple was built by Zerubbabel, and he led 42,360 Jews from Babylonian captivity back to the temple about 516 BC. Well, not all Jews went back at that one point in time, including Esther. She stayed in Persia. It doesn't mean that she wouldn't have eventually gone back. It just means that she didn't go back yet. And then that second temple, just for historical purposes, was destroyed in 70 AD. All right, so that gives you a little bit of context about who Esther is and why she was there in Susa. Like I said, her name was also Hadassah. That's the Hebrew name meaning myrtle. The myrtle tree refers to life, fertility, peace, well-being, strength, flourishing in adversity, and righteousness. So mostly, if you look up the name Hadassah, it will say that it's righteous. It's a righteous name. Esther means hidden godliness. And some believe that these two names foretold her future because she was placed in this palace and she was a Jew and she had to be righteous. And she also was, in some sense, hiding. And we'll learn more about that in a minute. And she lived with her cousin Mordecai, and a lot of people confuse this, and I do this sometimes too, thinking he's the uncle, but he's actually the cousin. So she lived with her cousin Mordecai after her parents died. And we don't know who her parents were or why they died. We just know that she lived with Mordecai. Truly, at this point, we don't know much else about Esther. We do know a little bit more about Mordecai, and I'll explain that here in a slide or two. So once Vashti was dismissed from her royal appointment, the king sent a decree across the land that forced young women from their homes to a 12-month beauty regimen for virgins. And this is where I think this is more like human trafficking, what we call today human trafficking, because this was not voluntary. All these young girls had to do this, and some of them were young, even preteens, that had to leave their home and go to this palace. The parents, the family members of these young women would have worried. They would have been very concerned about where their daughters were going and what was going to happen to them. And after this beauty pageant of sorts was finished, it didn't mean that the women were released to go home to their parents. Most of them stayed in control of the king. The king had control of all these women for the rest of their lives. So once these women were taken from their home, many of them never saw their families again. The idea was that for 12 months, the women had to bathe in different oils and receive different beauty treatments to make them as pure and as sweet smelling and as beautiful as possible. And one by one, each girl would spend a night with the king. Now, we don't know all the details about what happened, but you can imagine perhaps they were going to have their first sexual experience with the king. For most of these girls, they were virgins, if not all of them. So it would have been their first sexual experience in their life. And they went to spend one night with the king. And the king would then decide, is this the woman he wants as queen or not? And he would toss her about and then bring the next woman up. And this could have gone on for months or years. We don't really know how long it took. So Esther's cousin Mordecai, we read in Esther 2, 5-7, now there happened to be a Jewish man in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai. He was the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives, who had been carried into exile with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had taken into exile. Now he was acting as the guardian of Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for neither her father nor her mother was alive. This young woman was very attractive and had a beautiful figure. When her father and mother died, Mordecai had raised her as if she were his own daughter. Now enters another character for this historical event. His name is Haman. Haman was one of the top leaders in Xerxes' royal hierarchy. We'll say royal hierarchy. So Haman was an Amalekite. Amalek, who was the grandson of Esau. So he's in that lineage. We have Esau. Under Esau, we have the grandson, which is Amalek, and eventually we have Haman. So he's related back to Esau. However, the Amalekites were enemies of the Israelites. And this is important because if we remember, the Israelites are the chosen people of God. Esther, being a Jew, is one of the chosen ones of God. Mordecai would be an Israelite. And then here we have this high-ranking official that is their enemy, their biggest enemy. And we don't know if Xerxes was completely oblivious to all of this or not, but if you can imagine, then we have Xerxes and Esther, and directly under Xerxes then is Haman. So Haman is probably holding some grudges, and we don't know at this point in time if Esther had revealed that she's a Jew. We don't think that she did, and this is that hidden godliness. We think that she, at this point in time, knew that she was being put in this position for some mysterious reason that she didn't know yet. So she was probably keeping that information hidden. In the 1 Samuel 15, we see that God told the Israelites to destroy the Amalekites. They were to destroy everything that they have. It says they were told, don't spare them. They sent in 200,000 foot soldiers, 10,000 men of Judah, and they were to kill every single Amalekite. But they didn't. They left one person, the king Agag. In this then lies the problem. Now some will say, oh, but God is a loving God. Why would God tell them to kill people? Well, we see throughout history that God does this, right? When God gets upset or angry or he just needs to wipe the slate clean, we see that he does this. We saw it with Noah and the flood. He looked through all the land, all over the earth, and found one man and his family that were doing the right thing. And everybody else was sinning. So he wiped the earth clean and kept Noah's family. We saw that in Sodom and Gomorrah. We also saw it with even Babylonian times when he took down the Tower of Babel. Now, he didn't kill all of those people, but he changed their languages to disperse them. So we see this time and time and time again, where God's telling his people to be good, to follow the rules, to do the things he wants them to do. And when they don't, he sometimes takes care of that. In this case, he wanted the Israelites to get rid of the Amalekites. They were the worst enemy, the biggest enemy of all the land. And they left one person alive. And from that one person, then Haman came. Now you can see even more of the strife that would have been going on in that palace. Haman wasn't just any leader in the king's army. He was the biggest enemy of the Israelites. In Esther 3, it says, sometime later, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, exalting him and setting his position above that of all the officials who were with him. As a result, all the king's servants who were at the king's gates were bowing and paying homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded. However, Mordecai did not bow, nor did he pay homage. So there lies the problem. This is where it starts with Mordecai and Haman. Haman sees that Mordecai isn't bowing down and praising him and giving him all this honor and glory that he thinks he deserves. Mordecai is a Jew. The only person he will bow down to is God. He will not bow down to a human being. And Haman doesn't like that. Haman goes to the king and tells the king that he has people in the city that are not bowing down to him. He asks the king if he can go out and destroy these people. In Esther 3, he says, if the king is so inclined, let an edict be issued to destroy them. I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to be conveyed to the king's treasuries for the officials who carry out this business. So the king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, who was hostile toward the Jews. The king replied to Haman, keep your money and do with those people whatever you wish. At this point in time, it's assumed that the king doesn't realize his own wife, Esther, is a Jew, nor her cousin, Mordecai, is a Jew. So what the king has just done is sent out an edict across all of the Persian Empire that every single Jew must be killed. And in those days, and even in the current day, most laws put in place are not redacted. They're not sent back to say, I didn't mean to say redacted. They're not pulled back, let's use that word, to say that, oh, I made a mistake. We shouldn't do that. Let's change this. That doesn't usually happen. So in this case, the idea that anybody could save the Jews at this point looked very slim. Only God could have saved the Jews at this point. Now, through much back and forth, quietly, again, this hidden godliness, Mordecai and Esther couldn't get together and have a face-to-face conversation. That was essentially illegal. Esther had to stay in the palace, and Mordecai had his own places he had to stay. So there wasn't any way that those two could get together and have a conversation of what to do. Queen Esther did know, though, that if anybody approached the king uninvited, they could be put to death unless the king offered a golden scepter. And in this image, this is what's left of King Darius's palace. That's Darius actually holding the golden scepter. And these people on the right that are walking towards him are hoping that that scepter will be extended to them so that they can speak freely and keep their life. Now, if that scepter is not presented, then those people would be rushed off and killed. And at this point in time, when Esther receives word of what's happening with the Jews, she had not been invited to go to the king for 30 days. It's not like they saw each other every night. They didn't sleep in the same room. They didn't have dinner together. So she couldn't casually mention this to him. And Mordecai told Esther, and again, this is a little bit of back and forth through the eunuchs because he couldn't directly go talk to her. But he said, don't imagine that because you are part of the king's household, you will be the one Jew who will escape. If you keep quiet at this time, liberation and protection for the Jews will appear from another source. I believe that means God. While you and your father's household perish, it may very well be that you have achieved royal status for such a time as this. So here we are. Esther is presented with the problem, and she needs to make a decision. And Esther replies with a request for all Jews in Susa to fast on her behalf. She says, "Don't eat and don't drink for 3 days, night or day." She said her servants and her will do the same, and then she will go to the king. She closes with saying, "If I perish, I perish." So she was willing to risk it all. In fact, I don't know that she had any way out of it. If she sat quietly, she would die. If she spoke up, she could die. But what I love about this part is that we see she didn't rush to any decision. When we have big decisions to make, we need to stop and pray. And we need to look at how we can bring wise counsel with us. In this case, Esther didn't fast and pray on her own. She asked for every single Jew in Susa to do it with her. She needed that community, and we need community too, that we need to come together and pray with each other. And for those of us that fast or that are able to fast, there are times when fasting is appropriate. Now, the fast of Esther shows this valuable model of how a community can come together in support. When we have big decisions to make, or when we have big issues that are confronting us, fasting is a powerful tool. Before you fast, though, please check with your doctor to make sure that it's not going to cause any health-related issues. Usually, fasting includes not eating a certain food, not eating any food, or not drinking for a period of time. And we believe that our bodies can live for 3 days without water. I don't know. So that's why I say talk with the doctor before you do that. But in this case with Esther, she did not drink, she did not eat for 3 days, nor did the other Jews in the Persian Empire. Personally, I've gone for 40 days without drinking Coke. Now that may sound silly, but truly I tell you, that was a difficult fast for me. I thought, oh, this might be easy, but it wasn't. And then through that fasting process, I learned how insignificant my sacrifice was, that I'm only trying to not drink Coke. And Jesus died for me. He gave the ultimate sacrifice, and how hard it was for me to truly say no when I would sit down to a meal to not drink Coke. And how silly that seems, but how that really did bring me closer to God in knowing that I was making some very minuscule sacrifice for him. And he made this huge, monumental, life-changing sacrifice for us. So consider fasting, even if it's not an entire meal or all of your beverages, but perhaps it's a certain food for a period of time. In my case, I did Coke. I've done it with sugar. Some people do it with meat. Some people just do meat on a certain day, like through the period of Lent. They won't eat meat on Friday. There's all sorts of ways to fast. Sometimes I'll fast from watching television or using the internet. I'll fast from using social media. So there's lots of ways that you can fast. I'd say don't pick the easy way because when we pick the easy way, are we really making a sacrifice? For example, if I don't like Brussels sprouts, which I do, but if I don't, and I say, well, I'm going to fast from eating Brussels sprouts for 40 days, is that really a sacrifice? But pick something that would be. Maybe it's chocolate. Maybe it's, if you're a smoker, maybe it's fasting from using cigarettes. Maybe it's fasting from listening to the radio. Maybe it's fasting from watching television. Any of those things that would actually be a true sacrifice, something that you can feel that would bring you closer to God. And also with the word fast, I thought this was interesting. When I was doing the research, I found that the word breakfast actually comes from the idea of fasting. So we'll see later that after Esther does what she does and the Jews are freed and they want to celebrate this year after year after year, which they still do today. The period of fasting that they use is a 24-hour period. starting on one day and ending 24 hours the next day. And that includes your sleep time. So with that, the word breakfast then comes from break our fast. And that goes all the way back to this time with Esther, where people would fast for a 24-hour period. And then when they wake up, that's when they would break the fast. Okay, so to get to the outcome of our historical event, we know that after 3 days of fasting and praying, Esther approached King Xerxes, and he did offer the golden scepter, so she did not die. Esther didn't jump right to the meat of the matter, though. She didn't say, oh, you have to hear what's happening. No, she still remained calm, and she invited the king and Haman to a banquet. At the banquet, the king asked her, what is it that you want? And she proceeded to then tell him everything that was happening and how Haman saw Mordecai not bowing down, and Haman got upset, and that Haman then went to his family, and his wife was the one that said, you should build this large gallows 75 feet high and hang Mordecai. And Haman thought that was a good idea. So Haman went to the king, convinced him that he should kill all the Jews, and the king agreed. Well, interestingly enough, the king didn't make a decision right away either. And he went back to Haman and he said, what do you think we should do? And Haman gave him this long, detailed description of, well, I think you should, dress the victor with royal clothing and lead him through the city with a horse and let everybody know that this is the one that's victorious. And the king thought, that's a great idea. So you do that to Mordecai. So here we have it now. Haman has had to lower himself to put Mordecai up on the horse, dress him in royal garments, lead him through the town and say what a great person he is. And then at the end, Xerxes used that 70 feet high gallows to hang Haman. Now going back to Purim, that's the name of the Jewish festival that celebrates this victorious event for all of the Jews. It's written out in Esther 9:22 that this is a time of feasting and celebration. They also give gifts of food and drinks to one another, and they give gifts to the poor. And they also read the historical events of Esther. So you could read the Book of Esther. The dates of Purim in 2021, it was in February, but in future years, 2022, 2023, and 2024, it's in March. And you see, it's usually just this 24-hour period. They're not fasting for 3 days like Esther did, but they're just remembering the event that took place, fasting for 1 day. And with all of this, they are then, actually I said fasting, they're feasting, not fasting. They're feasting and celebrating for a 24-hour period. Esther and the Jews back then did all the fasting. So here they're just celebrating their freedom as Jews. All right, and that is the Book of Esther in a nutshell. Now there is more. There's one other assassination attempt actually on the king that I haven't mentioned. So I highly recommend that you read the Book of Esther. I also recommend that after you read the Book of Esther, watch the movie One Night with the King. It's a beautifully done movie that is pretty accurate when you compare it to what the Bible says. So I would encourage you to do that. Well, I hope this has been helpful to you to understand more about who Esther is and why this book of Esther in the Bible is so important.